It has been just over 5 years since I started making game dev videos. I've made over 90 videos showing off my progress on projects, pixel art I drew for challenges, and games I made, mostly for game jams. I've learned a lot along the way, from making games fun, making interesting videos, and making cool pixel art. However, it's not always been smooth sailing. I've made many mistakes along the way, but each has been an invaluable chance to improve. Recently, I reviewed all the games I made in the last 5 years. I wanted to know where each game went right or wrong, find the common pain points, and see what I can do to improve my future games. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Lewis, also known as Skeffles, and welcome to this video about my 5 years of game dev mistakes and the lessons I've learned from them. The first few mistakes fall into the topic of failing to attract players. You need that initial moment that captures someone's curiosity so that they click on your game. You have two primary ways of doing this: the title and the thumbnail, sometimes referred to as the cover image or capsule art. This is very similar to YouTube, although what these should be differ from YouTube to games. YouTube titles and thumbnails are about sparking curiosity that the video must deliver on. For example, this devlog here. The thumbnail captures your attention with the game art and tells you the answer is cursors. You then read the title, How I Fixed a Hidden Flaw in My Game. This makes you wonder how cursors fix my game and gets you clicking into the video. From that point, it's the video's responsibility to keep the viewer watching. For games, this is a little different. A game is an experience that you play through. Often they are a creative outlet for developers, meaning that games end up with more thematic or artistic titles. Titles like Counter-Strike, Age of Empires, or a third, more up-to-date game, Elden Ring. Game thumbnails are about giving the vibes of the game. Usually they include the title and either concept art or in-game art. With that in mind, how well did my games fare? The first game in this list is Gods of Hell, which I made for the 2020 GMTK Game Jam. This title tells you almost nothing about the game, and the thumbnail doesn't help either. This is essentially a screenshot with the title slapped on. The sprites are tiny, the background looks bad, and there's nothing to capture the player's curiosity. This approach is terrible, and I obviously didn't learn from this, as I've used screenshots as game thumbnails many times, with the most recent in 2024. Second is Project Torum, the game I made throughout 2020. It has a slight improvement over these screenshot thumbnails. This thumbnail was created using art from the game, which gives off the game vibe without any of the gameplay details getting in the way. One look at this, and you get a good understanding of the game. I recently tried this approach again with Deep Diver, the game I made for the 2025 Global Game Jam. I think this turned out even better, and I suggest using this approach if you want your thumbnail to look like your game. The next approach I've used is simple thumbnails. I first tried this with Dice Combat, the game I made for the 2022 GMTK Game Jam. The title is basic but descriptive, and the thumbnail contains relevant images which capture the player's curiosity. This is something I've tried to replicate with a few other games, but I don't think I ever had the same amount of success as Dice Combat. But that's not the point. The point is, I suggest using this approach if you don't want your thumbnail to reveal too much. The last approach I've used is utilizing concept art, such as with my museum building demo. I suppose this is similar to creating a thumbnail to look like your game, as concept art is what you want your game to look like. But with my museum management game, I think it captures the player's curiosity quite well, as it gives you an idea of what you can create within the demo. In the end, what works for your game will depend on what your game is like, how it looks, and who your game is for. I suggest avoiding using screenshots. Instead, take the time to create something bespoke for your game that will capture players' curiosity. Even if you're working in a time limit, because even the best games will never get clicked on if you lose that initial moment. Keeping on the topic of failing to attract players, once someone has clicked on your game, they're taken to your game page. You've now got their undivided attention and must persuade them to play. The less barriers there are to the game, the better. So how are my game pages? Starting with Gods of Hell, we've got the thumbnail at the top of the page, and a number of screenshots and a trailer which all look very similar to the thumbnail. There's an irrelevant description, which loses the player's interest as you don't learn more about the game. A better example is Project Torum. The background, the screenshots, and the description all add to the initial impression of the game and make it feel consistent. The description is organized to let you know more about the game and what you're getting into. By the time you get to the download button, you already know if you're going to click it. You don't always need this level of polish. Deep Diver has less on the page itself, however you can play directly from the browser, so the page has to do less to persuade you to play. You can just play. I've seen browser builds increase the number of players to my games firsthand when I switched to using Godot and started creating them. This works particularly well in game jams when players are going to play a lot of games, so don't want to put too much effort into installing them. I've also found that they often work on mobile, if you add on-screen controls. This is a major benefit, as showing your game is as easy as sending people a link or handing them your phone. This doesn't mean you should just ignore downloadable builds though. Players that consciously install a game have a greater connection to it, you can get better performance out of the game, and some platforms, like Steam, only support downloadable games. In the end, the type of build you go for really depends on who your target audience is. I recommend browser builds for quick projects, but downloadable builds for your long-term projects. With that being said, you may find you don't get a choice in the matter, as some game engines don't support browser builds. This was the situation for my old games, and is the situation for my museum management game. If, like me, you find yourself in this situation, I suggest you consider the installation process for the player. Obviously, platforms like Steam will download and install the game for players, but platforms like Global Game Jam just host the zip containing your game. How easy is it to run the game from this? Let's take a look at the Department of Lost and Found, the game I made for the 2021 Global Game Jam. Once you've downloaded and extracted the contents, you're greeted with 2 folders and a README. README files are a nice idea, although often ignored. Either way, even if you read it, it doesn't tell you which folder the game is in. Weirdly, it doesn't matter though, because for some reason I put builds in both folders. However, you have to find them in quite a large list of files. Running the executable will show a warning, because it's not signed and was downloaded from the internet. And even then, there's a chance it won't run if you don't have the .NET runtime installed. This is just too many barriers for the game. Luckily, there are things you can do to lower these barriers. Recently, with my museum game, I started using self-contained builds, which include the .NET runtime in the build. I'm also looking at single file builds which bundle everything into one file, meaning it's obvious which file to run. It's never going to be perfect, but there'll always be steps you can take to improve the experience. That all said, unfortunately, game jams can often add another barrier to players in the form of submission pages. If we take the submission page for Gods of Hell as an example, we can see it doesn't provide much customization beyond a short description, jam information, and screenshots, which I already mentioned look too similar to the thumbnail and lose the player's attention. I think Wizard Retreat, the game I made for the 2023 GMTK Game Jam, does a much better job with this, as the screenshots show off the game, make it feel more consistent, and grow your curiosity. Similarly, this is the Global Game Jam page for Deep Diver. It essentially has the same customization as Itch. Like Wizard Retreat, I think these screenshots help show off the game, make it feel consistent, and grow the player curiosity. Finally, Ludum Dare pages. Like this one for Base Defender, the game I made for the 47th Jam, give you a lot more customization. You can add any multimedia you like, so you can create more enticing pages. I don't think you should overdo it though, as you still need to get players to your main game page before they can play. As for the page for Base Defender itself, I think it's quite good because it gets across what the game is with the animated GIF, and it stands out in a sea of pages filled with screenshots. In some ways, the amount of customization these pages provide is very similar to Steam. I've never released a game on Steam, however I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it here, as that is my eventual goal for my museum management game. Steam pages primarily capture the player's interest through screenshots, videos and descriptions. Players also look at review scores to get a collective understanding of a game. You can add a lot more to a Steam page, but you can't guarantee players will look at it. Okay, so we've discussed titles, thumbnails, game pages, download versus browser. Let's say the player has gone through all of these barriers. What's next? The next mistakes fall into the topic of failing to welcome the player, as barriers to play exist within the games themselves. Let's start by considering how the player is greeted when a game starts. My first few games had start screens. Gods of Hell, for example, had a start screen that showed you the game controls, but doesn't tell you how to play, which led to a lot of confusion. Later on, I created a game menu to greet the player, which was developed over a number of games. I think this peaked in Super Word Chain, the game I created for the chain letter jam. This menu allowed me to use common features across my games, such as a splash screen, settings menu, and instruction screen. It made the games feel more consistent and professional. Unfortunately, I lost this when I transitioned to using Godot, and my games have been inconsistent ever since. Some games have just thrown you into playing, others have used start screens, and Wizard Retreat uses a level selection screen. I quite like this level selection screen as it reminds me of the main menu from my older games. Ideally, I bring back a common menu for my games to give the player a more consistent welcome. Speaking of which, I've been looking at how games can introduce their gameplay to players. Like I mentioned a moment ago, my old games had instruction screens. These are great to tell the player the controls and gameplay objectives, although can vary in quality. Project Tyrant had a very basic screen, but Super Word Chain had an excellent one, as it used animations to illustrate controls and objectives to the player. Tutorials are arguably a better way at introducing gameplay to the player. I first tried this in Wizard Retreat, although I found it wasn't a very good tutorial, as it was essentially a bunch of static text on the first level. Unless you really took your time to work out what it was trying to say, it left players confused. I tried to create a more interactive tutorial for Shrinker's Workshop, the game I made for the 2024 GMTK Game Jam. This tutorial is made up of a series of hints that tell you what to do and only move on when you finish the task. This interactivity is much better than the static example from before, although I still want to improve on it. I'd love for the tutorials to point you to your next hint and have a wider range of hints teaching you how to play. The next set of mistakes go under the topic of not doing enough testing. As soon as players get their hands on your game, they will find all the bugs and rough parts. If there are too many, they will quit. Obviously, testing doesn't fix this, but allows you to find those moments and fix them. This is something I've struggled with, especially for short-term projects like game jams. The worst of my games for this is Warden of the Forest, the game I made for the 2023 Global Game Jam with some friends. The game is riddled with bugs that make it hard to play and eventually impossible to beat. I think this is because we focused on our own individual parts, didn't test until last minute, and didn't communicate well throughout the jam. Take these flowers as an example. You interact with them, they grow, and you can climb them like a ladder. This worked just fine in the test scene, but completely broke in the actual game. This is because the flowers use a shared resource for their texture and collision boxes, meaning one flower would change all the flowers. Both the level editor and coder assumed the flowers worked fine, and we only found out there was a problem at the very last minute. I suspect if we had done regular testing of the whole game, this would have been caught and we would have found a fix for it. Now, testing isn't all about finding bugs like this. It can also be about finding the balance to a game and improving the player experience. For example, when I developed Deep Diver, I got my girlfriend to test an early build of the game, and it was significantly harder than I had intended. The oxygen drained incredibly quickly and bubbles rarely spawned, meaning you often died before you even got going. This led me to lowering the oxygen drain mechanic and making bubbles spawn based on how much oxygen you have left. This made playthroughs last much longer and the game way more enjoyable. I've had less issues like this for my long-term projects, for example my museum management game. It has a suite of unit tests that check the building mechanics work, and the way I've released demos have provided me with plenty of feedback to improve the player experience. It's taken time and effort to do, but I think it's in a much better place than anything else I've worked on over the last 5 years. The last mistake I want to discuss falls into the topic of not putting enough thought into the game progression. This is a common weak point throughout my games, usually because I felt I haven't had enough time to develop something meaningful for the player. For example, Dice Combat is a game about fighting enemies by rolling dice. The game only has one type of enemy and a fixed set of dice, which you have no control over. As a result, the gameplay has you kiting enemies and rolling dice until you get a good roll. If I were to change this, I'd introduce waves of enemies that get harder as you go, and between waves you get access to a shop where you can upgrade your dice. This will give you a sense of progression and tactics as you play. Project Tarum is another example of not putting enough thought into the player progression. I balanced the game on how much money you gain per wave, aiming to unlock a new tower every 5 or so waves. This works well, but when you dig into the details you find the meta is to just use the lowest tier tower. This is because I didn't consider the power of the different towers or the price of the upgrades. This means new towers, tower upgrades, and even selling towers are almost completely redundant features. If I were to change this, I'd make sure that new towers and upgrading towers were worth using based on the damage output and price of each tower. I'd also make selling towers less punishing, so you don't feel bad for doing it. In some ways, it's easy for me to see all these mistakes, feel bad, and like I can't make good games. But for all the mistakes I've made in the last 5 years, I've had amazing moments too. Each game has something fun inside them, and I've had positive memories creating all of them. As I look to the future, I know things can only get better, as I strive to improve on everything I've discussed in this video. For example, I want to make sure that my game pages and thumbnails represent the games as best they can to attract more players. I want the installation process to feel as smooth as possible so players can get into the games quickly. And once in the game, I want the player to feel welcome and at home. I'll introduce them to the gameplay through interactive tutorials and balance the game through rigorous testing, catching any issues such as bugs, progression, and rough patches in the user experience. And really, the user experience is what this is all about. The biggest mistake you can make in game dev is only focusing on one part of your game. Whether that's art, mechanics, or level design, your game is much more than that. Games are an entire experience that you have to tailor from start to finish, and if you do that right, players will come back for more. I hope you've enjoyed watching me ramble on about my game dev mistakes. Leave the video a like to let me know you did, and subscribe for more great game development content like this devlog for my museum management game. Thanks for watching, goodbye.